I always thought the body would give a warning before shutting down. A buzzing in the ears, a spinning room, a heartbeat that hammered too loudly. Instead, it happened in the middle of a perfectly ordinary moment, while I was standing at the front counter of the store, explaining a return policy to a customer who wasn't even listening. One moment I was upright, the next I felt the ground tilt like it had been kicked from beneath me. My vision blurred at the edges, the world dimming as if someone slowly turned the lights down. I remember the sound of my own breath trying to catch up, the way my hands trembled when I reached for the counter, and then, nothing. Just blackness, like falling through a quiet tunnel with no sense of where I would land. When I opened my eyes again, the ceiling above me was painfully white, and the soft beeping of monitors pulsed somewhere to my right. My chest rose slowly as if even breathing required permission. The air smelled cold and sterile, and for a moment I couldn't recognize anything. Not the hospital room, not the faint shadows cast along the wall, not even the soft weight of the blanket over me. I blinked up at the fluorescent lights, trying to piece together where I was and why my tongue tasted like metal. My throat felt thick, my limbs heavy, and my mind struggled to catch up to a reality that arrived without explanation. A nurse stepped into the room, her shoes whispering across the floor. She greeted me softly, the kind of voice someone uses when they're relieved you woke up. She asked if I knew my name. I nodded. The motion made my head throb. She checked my vitals, her hands cool against my wrist as she explained I had collapsed at work and been brought in by ambulance. She told me I had been dehydrated, exhausted, and under far more stress than my body could handle. She said it gently, but there was a heaviness in her eyes that made me feel exposed, like she saw right through me. Then she mentioned they had called my emergency contacts, my parents, and confirmed the number twice. They were informed right away, she said quietly, adjusting the blankets. We told them it was important. For a moment I let that sink in. My parents had been called. They knew I was in a hospital bed. They knew I had collapsed. They knew I had been alone when it happened. The nurse lingered for a moment before leaving the room, and the door's soft click echoed louder than anything else, because it told me everything I needed to know. My parents weren't coming. Not now. Not soon. Maybe not at all. I stared at the empty space where they should have been. 2 chairs sitting untouched, a small table with no flowers, no card, not even a forgotten bag or jacket to suggest someone had worried enough to rush here. I tried to rationalize it at first. Maybe they hadn't heard the phone. Maybe they misunderstood the severity. Maybe they were on the way. But each excuse dissolved the longer I lay there, watching the door remain closed. When your mind has been trained to justify being neglected, you become an expert at creating reasons that protect you from the truth. But even experts reach their limit. And the truth was simple: they chose not to come. Whether out of indifference, annoyance, or the same old resentment that followed me throughout childhood, the reason didn't matter. The absence did. Time stretched strangely in hospitals. Minutes felt like hours, and silence felt heavier than noise. The beeping from the monitor steadied, but my heart didn't. I tried to sit up, wincing as the 4-line tugged against my arm. The room wobbled slightly. I pressed the call button and the nurse returned, encouraging me to rest. She asked if there was anyone else she should call. A friend, a coworker, anyone who might care enough to come. I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. The truth was embarrassing in ways I didn't want to admit out loud. I had no one else listed. I had believed that if someone called my parents with the words, "Your child is in the hospital," it would be enough. It wasn't. She gave me a sad look. The kind of sympathy strangers are allowed to give when they witness something private but undeniable, and then she left quietly. I forced myself to breathe slowly, trying to keep my chest steady, but every inhale seemed to press against a memory I didn't want to revisit. Growing up, my parents had always treated emergencies differently depending on who the emergency belonged to. When my sister twisted her ankle at a school event, they rushed to her side with ice packs and panicked breaths. When I broke my wrist falling from the playground slide, they told the school to wait until work was done. They always showed up when it came to her, the golden child, the one whose problems felt like crises. Mine didn't. A soft vibration buzzed from the bedside table, pulling me from the memory like a hand tugging on my sleeve. My phone. I reached for it slowly, my fingers still shaky, and turned the screen over. For a moment I expected a message from my mom or dad. Something simple, "We're on the way." Or even, "Are you okay?" Anything at all. But it wasn't from them. It wasn't even a message. It was a notification. A tag. From my sister. I blinked as the screen lit up with her latest story post. She had tagged me in a video. Smiling, laughing, recording herself at a brunch table with friends, music playing in the background. The caption was bright and bubbly, self-care day with the best people. And underneath it she wrote, "Meanwhile, guess who fainted at work? Face with tears of joy at me." She used my name like a joke. Like entertainment. My hand froze around the phone. The hospital room felt smaller suddenly, pressing in around me. I stared at her words, each one slicing through whatever fragile hope I had left that maybe, just maybe, someone in my family would care. She hadn't checked up on me. She hadn't asked if I was conscious, breathing, scared, or alone. She had taken my collapse, something the nurses had described with concern, something frightening enough for paramedics to rush me here, and turned it into content. A performance. A public laugh. A way to show her friends that she was living freely while her sibling was unconscious in a hospital bed. The nurse walked in again to check on me, but she paused when she saw my face. I didn't need to explain. The glow of my phone screen, the tears gathering silently at the corners of my eyes, the tag still open. It told the entire story. She stepped closer, gently took my phone and placed it face down on the table. She squeezed my shoulder softly, not saying anything because she didn't need to. Some moments don't require words. They only require someone to witness your hurt without dismissing it. I lay back slowly, staring at the ceiling again. Only this time the white tiles didn't feel empty. They felt like they were holding every unanswered question I had tried to bury for years. Why was I the one always left behind? Why was I the one treated like an afterthought? Why did the people I loved most make me feel invisible even when I was fighting to stay conscious? A tear rolled down my temple. I didn't push it away. Because this time I wasn't pretending I didn't know the answer. When I finally picked my phone up again, the screen was dark, but the weight of what I had seen still pressed against my chest like an invisible hand. The nurse had turned it face down as if shielding me from the world, but the world doesn't disappear just because you look away from it. I flipped it over slowly, half hoping the story would be gone, that my mind had exaggerated it in the fog of fatigue. It was still there. My sister's laughter frozen in pixels, the brunch table bright with plates and sunlight, my name bright in the tag like a spotlight I never agreed to stand under. Notifications were already climbing, tiny red numbers stacking up with a speed I didn't want to measure. People were reacting. Not with concern, with humor. Messages rolled in from distant relatives, coworkers I barely knew, old classmates who had seen the tag and decided it was safer to laugh than to ask if I was breathing. "You okay?" Followed by laughing emojis. "Girl, you really fainted at work? Your sister is wild for posting that." The words blurred together until they felt like static in my head. Each vibration of the phone was another reminder that my collapse had escaped the hospital room and entered the court of public opinion, where context is irrelevant and pain becomes entertainment. A nurse returned to check my for and noticed my shallow breathing. She asked me gently to put the phone down and rest. I wanted to explain that rest felt impossible now, that something larger than my body was unraveling. But I didn't have the energy to turn my heartbreak into a narrative for a stranger. I just nodded and placed the phone back on the table, though my eyes kept drifting toward it like it was a ticking device. Somewhere out there, my sister was still smiling at a brunch table, unaware or uncaring that every second her post remained live. It cut deeper into what little dignity I had left. Hours passed in fragments. A doctor came in to explain test results in calm, careful language. Dehydration. Exhaustion. Acute stress. He asked questions about my work hours, my eating habits, my sleep. He asked if I'd been feeling overwhelmed recently. I almost laughed at the understatement of it all. Overwhelmed was what you call a drawer that won't close. What I felt was more like living inside a pressure cooker that everyone around me kept tightening while pretending the heat didn't exist. So I answered politely. Because politeness had always been my instinct, even when my life was unraveling. Later that evening I finally received messages from my parents. Not calls. Messages. Short, detached, delayed. My mother's text read, "We heard you fainted. Your sister said you're okay now. Try to rest." My father's followed minutes later. "We'll talk later. Don't stress." I stared at those two lines until they felt surreal. They had not come. They had not asked the hospital for details. They had not asked if I was scared or in pain or alone. They had accepted my sister's narration of my medical emergency as sufficient reality. And that, more than anything else, told me exactly where I stood. My health mattered only after it had been filtered through the person they trusted most. Her. Not me. Another notification lit up the phone. My sister had added a follow-up story. This one was a selfie in the car, sunglasses on, lips glossed, sunlight pouring in. The caption read, "Headed to the spa after a long brunch. Manifesting good vibes only," and beneath it smaller text, "Hope my dramatic sibling is resting relieved-faced." Dramatic. That word settled into my body like a verdict. The nurse noticed the change in my face again and asked if I wanted someone to talk to, maybe a hospital counselor. I shook my head. Not because I didn't need one, but because I didn't yet know how to explain what it feels like to be publicly mocked by your own blood while lying in a hospital bed they ignored. There is no simple sentence for that. Only layers of quiet humiliation stacked on top of each other like paper cuts that never bleed enough for anyone else to take seriously. By morning, the tag had reached farther than I imagined. A coworker messaged me awkwardly to ask if they had crossed a line by laughing at my sister's post. A distant aunt commented under it with a smiling emoji, writing, "Kids these days are so funny." Even my supervisor had seen it, and while they expressed concern privately, the fact that my medical emergency had traveled faster than my own voice made me feel like I had lost control over my own story. I wasn't the one telling people what happened to me. My sister was. And she was telling it as a joke. A sharp realization cut through my exhaustion. This wasn't just cruelty. It was pattern. Growing up, my sister had always reshaped the narrative when it came to me. If I failed, she reframed it as entertainment. If I struggled, she recast it as inconvenience. If I succeeded, she minimized it as luck. And my parents, whether through bias, fatigue, or deliberate choice, always accepted her version of the story as default truth. I had spent years thinking this dynamic would soften with age. That maturity would balance it out. That adults learned to see more clearly. Lying in that hospital bed, watching my own collapse turned into content, I finally understood that some dynamics don't evolve. They calcify. The hospital discharged me that afternoon with instructions to rest, hydrate, and reduce stress. The irony almost made me bitterly amused. Reduce stress, the paperwork said, as if stress were an appliance you could unplug. My parents still hadn't come. They offered to pick me up, but only after being reminded by the nurse that I could not leave unescorted. When they arrived, they didn't rush. They didn't look frightened. They looked irritated by inconvenience. My mother asked the nurse if I'd fainted because I skip meals too often. My father asked if I'd be back at work by Monday. My sister didn't come at all. She was busy, my mother said gently, as if protecting her from the expectation of accountability. The drive home was quiet. Not the heavy silence of concern, but the shallow quiet of people who believe the matter has already been resolved. My parents spoke about errands, bills, dinner plans. No one asked how it had felt to wake up alone. No one mentioned the tag. I watched the road blur past the window and realized something chillingly simple. In their minds, the emergency had ended the moment I regained consciousness. Everything after that belonged to inconvenience, not compassion. When we pulled into the driveway, my mother finally said, "You really scared us." It took every ounce of restraint I had not to ask how that fear managed to look exactly like brunch and spa days. I went to my room and closed the door without argument. My phone buzzed again almost immediately. This time it was a private message from my sister. "Don't be so sensitive. Everyone knows you fainted, it's not that deep. People are just laughing." I read it once. Then again. The same hands that had publicly mocked me now asked privately for emotional flexibility, for forgiveness disguised as common sense. The emotional contradiction made my stomach tighten. I didn't reply. Hours later, the first rumor reached me in a form that shifted everything. A coworker sent a concerned message asking if it was true that my collapse had something to do with what the doctors found. I asked what they meant. There was a long pause. Then they replied cautiously, "Your sister mentioned something when she was live earlier, said the doctors were looking into something serious." My heart stopped for a moment at the phrasing. My sister had gone live. Without me. Without context. Without permission. And she had hinted at medical information she had no right to share. The collapse was no longer just a joke. It had become a teaser. And whatever truth my parents were choosing not to face, my sister was choosing to monetize in narrative. That was the moment I knew there was more being hidden than the humiliation alone. And that whatever the doctors had truly seen during those tests, it wasn't something my family was ready to acknowledge publicly. But the internet already had its appetite. And my sister had already opened the door. The message from my coworker sat on my screen long after I stopped touching the phone, glowing softly in the dim light of my bedroom as if it had its own pulse. Your sister mentioned something serious on her live. I read it again and again, each time feeling a new layer of dread settle into my chest. My sister had not only turned my collapse into a joke in a post, she had turned it into a story she was shaping in real time for an audience that had no right to the truth and no capacity for care. I lay back against my pillow, staring at the ceiling, hearing the muted sounds of my parents talking downstairs as if life were still unfolding on a normal timeline that no longer included me in the same way. For the first time since I collapsed, a colder question formed alongside the hurt. What did the doctors actually find? I had been given discharge papers, but they were careful documents, stripped of nuance and heavy language, filled instead with phrases like, monitor closely, and follow up immediately. At the hospital, the doctors had spoken in reassuring tones, but their eyes had lingered on me in a way I couldn't forget, a way that suggested they were comforting me without revealing everything. In my exhaustion and shock, I had accepted that kindness without question. Now, with my sister's live broadcast echoing in my mind, I realized how much had been left unsaid, not hidden from me intentionally perhaps, but postponed in the way professionals sometimes delay hard truths until the right support is present. My parents had not asked for that truth. They had not wanted to hear it at all. I quietly got up and walked to the door, listening first to make sure no one noticed. The house was subdued in the way it always was after something inconvenient happened. Voices kept low, tension disguised as calm. I padded down the hallway and stopped near the stairs just long enough to hear my parents' conversation clearly. My mother's voice was tight, strained in a way I had only ever heard when she was trying to control panic. She didn't need to hear it all at once, she said. We agreed on that. My father answered quietly, avoiding it doesn't make it go away. There was a pause. Then my mother replied, neither does confronting it without a plan. That was when my entire body went cold. They weren't talking about my collapse as an incident. They were talking about my condition as a reality. I retreated silently to my room and closed the door, my hands shaking now in a way they hadn't even in the hospital. They knew something. Something specific enough to argue about timing. Something serious enough to fear my reaction. I sat on the edge of my bed, my phone resting heavily in my hands, and debated confronting them directly. The anger in me felt ready to crack through the door and demand answers. But beneath that anger sat fear, vast and unstructured. I did not want to hear bad news formed out of my parents' mouths. Not after how casually they had allowed me to wake up alone in a sterile room with strangers around me instead of family. I called the hospital instead. The nurse who answered recognized my name immediately, her voice gentle but alert. I asked her to explain my test results in more detail. There was a pause on the line, not long but intentional. Did the doctor not review everything with you? She asked carefully. I told her I'd been given general guidance but not specifics. Another pause, longer this time. I'm not supposed to go beyond the charted explanation without your physician, she said, but you should be aware that your collapse was not simply from dehydration or stress. Those were contributing factors. There was an abnormality detected that requires urgent follow-up. My breath caught in my throat. What kind of abnormality? I asked, my voice barely steady. She hesitated again before replying, something that your doctor will need to explain in person. That was enough to tell me everything and nothing at once. Enough to confirm my parents had been shielding me from the reality of my own body. Enough to know that my sister's casual live had not been a wild exaggeration. Enough to understand why my parents had stayed away, not out of indifference alone but out of avoidance. Avoidance of watching their child receive news they themselves were terrified to hear. Avoidance of confronting a truth that could not be joked, minimized, or redirected the way everything else in our family always was. That night, sleep did not come. My mind played the same memories on repeat. The nurse saying my parents had been called, the empty chairs in the hospital room, my sister's laughing post, my parents' detached messages, the whispered conversation in the hallway. Everything rearranged itself into a single conclusion that felt heavy with inevitability. They had known it was serious from the beginning. They had chosen distance as their coping mechanism. And my sister had chosen attention as hers. By morning I could no longer pretend to rest. I dressed slowly and walked downstairs, moving with a quiet determination that surprised even me. My parents looked up from the kitchen table as I entered. My mother's eyes widened just slightly, the way they always did when she sensed a confrontation coming. My father folded his hands together, bracing. I didn't sit. I didn't ease into the conversation. I asked directly, "What did the doctors tell you when they called?" The question landed between us like a dropped object no one wanted to pick up. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it. My father answered instead, his voice subdued. "They said there were signs of something more serious than a fainting spell." I nodded slowly. "What signs?" I asked. He hesitated. "Something involving your heart rhythm and underlying stress on your system." My chest felt tight, not as a symptom now but as a reaction. "And you thought it was okay to leave me alone in a hospital bed with that information hanging in the air?" I asked quietly. My mother's eyes filled with tears immediately. "We didn't want to make it real yet," she said. "We needed time. Time. For them. Not for me." I laughed once, sharply and without humor. "It was already real," I said. "It was real when I collapsed on a cold workplace floor. It was real when strangers put IVs in my arm. It was real when I woke up alone. You just didn't want to sit with it." My father looked down at the table. My mother tried to reach for me but I stepped back. "You don't get to shield me from my own body," I said, my voice no longer shaking. "And you don't get to abandon me when it's inconvenient to face." Silence followed, thick and final. Only later that afternoon did the full truth finally arrive in official form. My doctor called me in for an urgent follow-up appointment the next day. The tests pointed toward a condition that would require long-term monitoring, strict stress management and lifestyle change. It wasn't immediately life-threatening, but it was real. It was permanent. It was something that would shape my future whether my family wanted to look at it or not. When he explained it calmly to me in his office, I felt strangely grounded. Fear existed, yes, but it was structured. It had contours. It could be faced. What I could not face as easily was the realization that my parents had known this was serious before I did, and had chosen emotional distance as their response. When I returned home, my sister was in the living room scrolling through her phone, smiling faintly at her screen. My parents had told her to be quiet, I could tell. There were no new posts. No lives. No updates. Just a careful silence that felt like damage control. She looked up when I entered, her expression uncertain for the first time since this began. I didn't speak to her. I walked past her and into my room. For once there was nothing she could reframe. The truth was no longer hers to perform. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the house settle into uneasy quiet, I understood something that changed me deeply. My collapse had not revealed my fragility. It had revealed my family's. The difference was that my fragility could be treated. Theirs had been hiding in plain sight all along. And now that it had been exposed, it would not survive in the dark the way it always had. My parents had stayed away from the hospital because they were afraid. Afraid of the diagnosis, afraid of their own helplessness, afraid of confronting the idea that control could not protect everything. My sister had turned my collapse into a performance because attention had always been her shield. And I, lying alone in that hospital bed, had finally been forced to see the pattern that explained my entire life with startling clarity. They didn't just hide the truth about my medical condition. They had hidden the truth about themselves. When I woke up the next morning, sunlight streamed through my curtains in warm, steady lines, but nothing inside me felt warm. My diagnosis sat quietly in my chest, not screaming, not threatening, just present. A truth that demanded to be acknowledged whether I wanted it or not. I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to process my doctor's calm explanation, the way he described the condition with steady hands and structured clarity. It wasn't something hopeless, but it was something real. Something I needed to treat, manage, and live with. Something that my parents had known might be serious before I did. And something my sister had all but trivialized for an audience who cared more about entertainment than accuracy or empathy. I sat up slowly, feeling the weight of the morning settle around my shoulders. The house was unusually quiet. My parents were downstairs, their voices muted but tense in that way adults speak when they are trying to keep the peace without confronting their own discomfort. I could hear the clinking of dishes, the low hum of the fridge, the shifting of chairs, all the sounds of normal life continuing as if nothing had ruptured. But something had. And everyone knew it. Even if they pretended breakfast could patch the hole. I checked my phone with cautious dread, half hoping my sister had deleted the earlier posts. Instead, I was met with notifications, dozens of them, messages from coworkers, acquaintances, and even people I barely remembered from high school. One message stopped me cold. "Are you okay? People are talking." I clicked the attached screenshot and my lungs tightened. It wasn't just that my sister had posted about me. It was that someone else had reposted her story, adding speculation, turning my collapse into an online mystery. A thread had begun, filled with guesses, assumptions, and commentary. Someone asked if I had a secret condition. Someone else joked about stress from family drama. A third person speculated wildly and incorrectly. The comments grew, each one stacking on top of the last until my health had become a topic of casual discussion for strangers who knew nothing about me. A narrative was forming without my consent, and I wasn't the one shaping it. I stepped downstairs holding my phone tight enough that my knuckles went pale. My parents looked up at me with fragile attempts at normalcy that instantly faltered. My mother forced a small smile. "Did you sleep?" she asked gently, as if the question could undo everything that had happened. I ignored it. "Did you see what's online?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. My father sighed, pushing his glasses up on his nose, a habit he had when he was overwhelmed. "Your sister told us she took everything down," he said carefully. "She promised she would." I let out a disbelieving breath. "She took some things down," I said. "But she didn't stop the story. And she didn't correct anything either." My parents exchanged a look that made my stomach twist. Tired, defeated, but still unwilling to hold her accountable in the way the situation demanded. I held up my phone so they could see the thread that had already begun spreading. "People are guessing what's wrong with me," I said. "They're making theories. They're treating my diagnosis like gossip, and she started it." My mother looked away. My father rubbed his forehead. After a long moment he said softly, "She didn't mean harm." Those 4 words hit me harder than any diagnosis could have. I'd heard some version of that sentence my entire life. She didn't mean harm. He's just young. She's overwhelmed. He didn't think. Excuse after excuse. This time I didn't let it slide. "This isn't about what she meant," I said. "It's about what she did." My mother flinched at my tone. My father started to speak, but I cut him off gently. "I am the one dealing with the consequences. Not her. I'm the one who woke up alone in a hospital bed while she was posting selfies. I'm the one people are messaging with concern and confusion. I'm the one who has to face this diagnosis. And I'm the one who has to handle the fallout of her turning my collapse into entertainment. Not her." Before they could respond, the front door opened and my sister walked in. Sunglasses. Perfectly styled hair. Shopping bags in hand. As if nothing in the world had shifted. She froze when she saw my face, not out of guilt but because she recognized the atmosphere. "What?" she asked, her voice soft with defensiveness. "Why is everyone acting weird?" My father took a breath to explain, but I stepped forward. "People are talking about me online because of your posts," I said. "They're speculating about my health. About my collapse. You didn't delete everything. You deleted the ones that made you look bad." She rolled her eyes instantly, the shield she used whenever she felt cornered. "Oh my God, it's not that serious," she said. "I didn't say anything specific. People are always dramatic." I stared at her, stunned at the casual dismissal. "Do you hear yourself?" I asked. "Do you understand that this is my real life? My health? My body? Do you understand that what you posted wasn't yours to share?" She scoffed. "Relax. You fainted. It's not the end of the world. People faint all the time." My mother murmured, "Sweetheart," in warning, but my sister ignored her. "Plus," she continued, "you're always so private. I figured it might help if people knew you're going through something. Maybe they'll, I don't know, give you attention for once." The sentence hit like a punch. She didn't post because she cared. She didn't post by accident. She posted because she thought it made her look supportive. And because my suffering gave her content. Anger washed through me, slow and hot. Not loud. Not chaotic. But precise. The kind of anger that comes after too many years of being dismissed, overshadowed, minimized, and misunderstood. I took a deep breath, trying to speak steadily. What I'm going through isn't for you to joke about. Or broadcast. Or use. My sister opened her mouth again, but this time my father's voice cut sharply through the room. Enough, he said. It wasn't loud. But it was final. My sister blinked in surprise, not used to hearing that word directed at her. My father stood slowly from the table, the weight of everything finally catching up to him. You crossed a line, he said. A serious one. My sister's face tightened with offense. I didn't do anything wrong, she insisted. People post about their siblings all the time. It's not like I said what the doctor told you. The air shifted abruptly. My mother inhaled sharply. My father's jaw tensed. And I felt my heart drop into my stomach. He knew. She knew something about my condition. And she had used it, not to help me, not to support me, but to fuel her online presence. Who told you? I asked quietly. She hesitated, suddenly aware she had said too much. Mom mentioned it. Kind of. My mother's face went white. I didn't tell her everything, she said quickly. I just needed someone to talk to. My sister shrugged. Well, you told me enough. She lifted her phone. And people are already asking questions, so. I stepped forward and gently pushed the phone down. No, I said. You are not posting anything else about me. The moment hung in stillness before my sister's expression shifted. Not to guilt, but to indignation. You don't control me, she muttered. You don't control what I post. My father shook his head. Actually, she's right, he said. You will not post about her again. And you will delete every trace of what you've already shared. My sister stared at him in disbelief. Why are you all overreacting? You're acting like she's dying or something. My mother whispered her name in warning, but my sister rolled her eyes again. Seriously, it's not even that big of a deal. She's the one being dramatic. That was it. That single sentence was the final fracture. I felt something inside me settle, not in resignation but in clarity. I had spent years waiting for my family to see me clearly, to treat me with the same care and urgency they gave her, to value my pain as real, to show up. But they hadn't. And now, standing in the living room with the aftermath of their choices swirling around us like dust, I finally understood something essential. It wasn't my responsibility to force understanding into people who benefited from misunderstanding me. Before anyone could say another word, my phone vibrated with a new notification. My sister froze. My father's eyes narrowed. A coworker had sent me another screenshot, this time of a comment under my sister's previous video. A comment that read, "She didn't collapse from stress. I heard it was something else. Check her family's page." My stomach dropped. The story had escaped. And now the truth, the real truth, was about to go public whether we were ready or not. The moment I saw that comment, something inside me went completely quiet. Not numb in the way of shock, but still in the way the ocean becomes just before a storm breaks. My sister stared at the screen in my hand, realizing too late that the narrative she thought she controlled had slipped beyond her reach. My parents stood frozen behind me, the weight of their silence now heavier than any argument they had ever avoided. The world outside our living room already had its claws in the story, already shaping it without permission, without truth, without care. And for the first time, I understood that no matter what I said or didn't say next, the life I had before my collapse was already gone. My phone began to vibrate again. And again. And again. Messages poured in. Some concerned, some invasive, some pretending to be concerned while clearly hungry for details. A coworker asked if I was really sick. An old classmate asked if the rumors were true. Someone I didn't recognize at all asked directly what diagnosis I had. I didn't answer anyone. I simply stood there watching the digital noise accumulate, knowing that silence would soon be interpreted as confirmation by those who preferred speculation to patience. I turned to my parents slowly, my voice steady in a way that even surprised me. "You kept the truth from me," I said. "You stayed away from the hospital. You let her turn my collapse into entertainment. And now the internet thinks it owns my body." My mother broke down then, fully and finally. She sank into a chair like her legs had given out beneath the accumulated weight of her guilt, pressing her hands over her face as tears slipped between her fingers. "We were scared," she whispered. "We didn't know how to handle it." My father lowered his head, his shoulders sagging as if the years he had spent maintaining balance between us had finally demanded payment. We thought protecting you meant keeping it quiet, he said. I nodded once. You protected yourselves, I replied quietly. There's a difference. The room filled with that truth and left nowhere to hide. My sister, however, remained standing, stiff, defensive, cornered. Her phone was still in her hand, her thumb hovering over the screen as if muscle memory alone might save her from consequence. You're all acting like I broke the law, she said bitterly. I didn't leak medical records. I made a joke. People took it too far. I looked at her fully for the first time since waking up in that hospital bed alone. You didn't make a joke, I said. You built a stage out of my pain and invited people to watch. Her jaw tightened. You're being dramatic. I smiled faintly, not from happiness but from clarity. That word doesn't work on me anymore. The comment exploded into a dozen variations within the hour. Screenshots multiplied. Threads grew longer. People speculated wildly about what kind of condition could cause a sudden collapse. Some guessed stress. Some guessed something worse. Others compared me to people they knew, turning my life into a pattern they felt entitled to decode. My identity was disintegrating into rumor at a speed I couldn't control. And that was when I realized the unthinkable truth. I could no longer live safely in a story that was being written for me by people who refused to respect my reality, whether those people were strangers online or my own blood. That evening, after the house fell into tense silence and the phones finally stopped vibrating long enough for thinking to return, I packed a bag. Not dramatically. Not in rage. Methodically. Medication. Documents. A few changes of clothes. The small notebook I had kept since college. I didn't slam drawers. I didn't cry. I simply prepared for distance in the same quiet way I had learned to endure disappointment. When my mother knocked softly on my door and saw the packed bag beside the bed, her fear finally surfaced in full. "What are you doing?" she asked. I answered with the calm of someone who had already made the decision. "I'm leaving." My father followed her into the doorway, his face pale with understanding before I even finished explaining. "You don't have to," he said softly. I nodded. "I know," I replied. "That's why I am." He looked at me for a long moment, then asked, "Where will you go?" I told him the truth. "Somewhere I'm not an afterthought." My mother's sob broke loose at that. She reached for me again, but this time I didn't step away, not out of forgiveness but out of finality. "I don't hate you," I whispered. "But I can't heal in a place where my pain is optional." My sister stood at the end of the hallway, arms crossed, eyes sharp. "So you're just running away?" she asked. I looked at her one last time. "No," I said quietly. "You ran from my collapse. I'm walking toward my life." For a brief second, something like uncertainty flickered in her eyes. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, buried beneath pride and deflection. "Fine," she muttered. "Do what you want." I nodded once. "I finally am." The ride to my friend's apartment felt surreal. The city lights passed like distant stars, detached from the gravity of everything I had just left behind. My friend didn't ask questions when she opened the door. She took my bag, poured me water, and gave me space. That simple hospitality, unfilmed, unperformed, unpublicized, felt more sincere than anything I had experienced in weeks. That night, as I lay on an unfamiliar bed listening to unfamiliar walls settle around me, I felt fear. Yes. But I also felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. Relief. The following days were brutal in their honesty. My parents called repeatedly. Sometimes with apologies. Sometimes with silence that felt like guilt. I answered only once, to set a single boundary. I would speak to them when I was ready, not when their discomfort demanded it. My sister never apologized. Instead, she posted vague messages about toxic energy, about protecting her peace, about people who can't take a joke and play victim. I blocked her without ceremony. Not out of anger. Out of necessity. My health required quiet. My recovery required distance from the very chaos that had helped weaken me. The truth about my condition eventually became public in the cleanest way possible. I shared it myself. Not in detail. Not in spectacle. In a single measured post that stated the facts without drama or invitation. I explained that I was managing a medical condition, that I was receiving care, and that I would not tolerate speculation, commentary, or performance built on my body. The response was immediate and overwhelming, not of curiosity but of respect. People who had whispered before now apologized. Co-workers offered quiet support. Even strangers expressed kindness in ways that felt sincere. And for the first time since my collapse, I own my own story again. My parents watched that restoration from a distance. They didn't defend themselves publicly. They didn't correct the narrative. In that silence I saw something new, not manipulation or denial but regret that could not be outsourced to anyone else. The reckoning they had avoided at the hospital had finally arrived in another form. Accountability without control. And my sister, stripped of her audience for this particular story, moved on to new content, new narratives, new performances. The internet forgets quickly. But people who live the truth do not. Months later, when my strength had returned and my days had settled into something steady, I met my father for coffee. Just him. Not as a family delegation. Not as a peace treaty. As two people standing on separate edges of the same truth. He apologized again, this time without justification. No fear. No excuses. Just ownership. And for the first time I believed him. That conversation didn't fix everything. But it built a bridge narrow enough to stand on without collapsing into the past. I never moved back home. Not because I couldn't. Because I wouldn't. The unthinkable choice I made wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about honoring the life I almost lost. Not just to a medical condition, but to years of emotional neglect disguised as normalcy. My collapse at work broke my body. But the months that followed rebuilt something far more important. My sense of worth. My story no longer belonged to the sister who tagged me for attention. It no longer belonged to the parents who hid the truth out of fear. It belonged to me, and to the quiet, deliberate strength it took to choose myself in a family that once only saw me when I was falling. And this time, even if I collapsed again, I would not be alone. If this story moved you, challenged you, or reflected a truth you've lived in silence, please like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories of survival, boundaries, and emotional justice.